You hear plenty about the old, but there's loads of awesome JRPGs that have released in the past 5 years too. In no particular order, here are 10 excellent modern JRPGs that I recommend to anyone. And we're starting with the Ys series with Ys 9 Monochrome Nox. A recommendation of an Ys game won't be a shock to any frequent viewer of this channel. My love for it as a series has been, I'd like to think, more than evident over the years. Ys 9 Monochrome Nox is not only the current latest release in the series, at least until Ys 10 Nordics comes out this October, but also the latest game chronologically in the Ys timeline. I recommend it over many of the others though because it's available on a multitude of modern hardware like PS4, PS5, Switch and PC. Ys 8 is the same in that regard, but I've recommended Ys 8 more than enough on this channel. I think its sequel deserves the spotlight this time around. Now, Monochrome Nox is an interesting game, and it does divide opinions somewhat because, for all intents, it goes against the grain of Ys as a series. It doesn't go for that moniker of grand, sprawling adventure across unknown lands. Instead, the entire game takes place inside a populated city. Adol, the game's protagonist, is apprehended at the gates of the prison city of Bolduc, and the adventure this time around sees him become a sort of vigilante. He gains the power of a Monochrome, which grants him a unique ability to zip around the city, and he is essentially boxed into Bolduc throughout the entire game, with the characters that later join him having the same perks. But even so, Monochrome Nox excels in its exploration and gameplay because of the setting itself. While I do prefer the offerings of, say, Ys 8, it still makes the premise work. The city of Bolduc becomes a playground, a sandbox for the new Monochrome gifts given to the player. With everything so close together, the Monochromes are able to utilise their abilities to the limits, like gliding among the rooftops or riding up the sides of buildings. As such, the group-based gameplay is arguably at its best here. It does stumble a bit in terms of its similar dungeon design, which is limited by the city of Bolduc itself, and I personally think that the OST as a whole isn't as strong as older titles, but it's still good in both regards. The only qualm I really have with recommending Ys 9 comes in its story. I actually think that the story in Monochrome Nox is among the best of the series, but that's because it understands its place in the lore of Adol's journeys. It's the last one in the timeline, and as such it can draw on many aspects of Adol's prior adventures, which it does on quite a few occasions. No doubt if you have that knowledge of earlier games, you'll enjoy it more. But that being said, it can still be enjoyed as a standalone too, I've got no doubts about that. You'll certainly have a better time if you have that prior knowledge, but it's not a deal breaker. And really, it's the fast-paced gameplay and exploration that sits at the forefront of Ys games rather than its narrative. Next up is this wonderful turn-based RPG, Monochrome Mobius Rights and Wrongs Forgotten. Monochrome Mobius was announced back in November 2021 and later released worldwide as Rights and Wrongs Forgotten for PS4, PS5 and PC. Now, it is worth mentioning that when the game first released, it had some glaring technical issues, but there's been a host of patches since to sort it out. Thankfully, the current release state is much better than where it initially started. Now, the special thing about Monochrome Mobius is that while it is a solid standalone title in its own right that can bring joy to any turn-based fan, Monochrome Mobius is actually part of a much wider world. It's a prequel to the events of the well-loved visual novel series Utawareru Mono, and stars younger iterations of certain characters like Oshtor, acting as the forerunner to Mask of Deception and Mask of Truth. I still maintain that the best experience for Monochrome Mobius is gained after playing the visual novel trilogy, but it can also do the job of bringing fans in from another angle, working in chronological order instead. That could be even more pertinent too when it seems that a sequel to the game is on the horizon. Despite being a radical shift in design from the visual novel titles though, Rights and Wrongs Forgotten covers all of the bases of a typical turn-based JRPG experience and does excel in a couple of those elements like exploration. Though not truly open world, there's plenty to find in terms of treasures and collectibles that you can later use to upgrade certain facilities as well. Another important aspect of the game, as ensuring your equipment is up to par, becomes another key part of progression. Should you have knowledge of the main trilogy too, you'll notice quite a few familiar areas dotted around the world that will hit you with a wave of nostalgia. The turn-based system is decent too, 4 playable characters utilising a ring-based system on the top right to determine turn order. You have skills, traditional levelling up, equipment management and some neat mechanics carried over from the main game like the overzeal state. The game is also presented fairly well. It has CG artwork over hand-drawn backgrounds, which is consistent with the design of its forebears that of course were visual novels. The OST is absolutely fantastic, which is a big plus for me, and the characters and story, which are oft the main draw of these games, are indeed the highlights once again. It is a slower adventure in terms of pacing, but eventually you'll start seeing how it all connects, and I derived a lot of satisfaction from seeing these characters, who are at the end of their personal arcs come the two Mask games, given fully realised origin stories of their own. Just like Monochrome Nox, therefore, it is going to be a game that you will enjoy more if you have that prior knowledge, but it's standalone enough to be a great experience alone too. Third game on this list will be Fire Emblem Three Houses. Yeah, I was surprised, but this did release within the last 5 years, but right on the cusp. It came out at the end of July 2019. It feels like it's been around for much longer, but I'll take it. Three Houses is yet another excellent Fire Emblem game, definitely a highlight of the Switch library and well loved among the majority of players. It still gets merchandise and fan art even today. The series is pretty much one of the cash cows for Nintendo in the modern era. Pretty crazy to think that it was very close to getting shelved before Fire Emblem Awakening came out. Three Houses just solidified that popularity even further though. Now, Fire Emblem Three Houses may not be the best game in the series, at least for me, but it is very strong in basically every area. It has huge amounts of replayability with the different routes available to the player, a great tactical system, good stories for the most part, and it's just wholly addicting to play. I can't deny that the two playthroughs I did were highlights of my year. Though in the same breath, I do have to concede that I ended my playthrough after that second run. Three Houses may be an excellent game, but I had no intention of playing through the first half of the monastery again to see the changes in the later parts of the story. If there were some way of skipping that, or at least streamlining it, then you've arguably got the best Fire Emblem game of the bunch. As was the case in Awakening especially though, the game places a lot more importance on social links between members. There's a huge cast of characters to grow closer to, many of which have enjoyable personalities and bonding events to get involved in. In short, you'll never be lacking for stuff to do in Three Houses, much like an actual teacher. It may be a long game, but there's plenty of content to get stuck into, with players' freedom and choice at the forefront of that content. It's pretty crazy what they are able to fit on that tiny cartridge. I'm sure you hear about Three Houses a lot on any other JRPG channel, but it's for a very good reason. It is quite simply one of the best experiences on the Switch and will remain as such for the future too. And talking about excellent experiences on the Switch, we cannot talk about those without a Xenoblade game, and it will be Xenoblade Chronicles 3 this time around that takes the crown, mostly because the other two, or at least their original versions, were released well over 5 years ago. But even still, play them all, some of Monolith Soft's finest work even to this day. They just have a knack of creating some of the most memorable modern JRPGs of our time, but please, if you can, Takahashi & Co., do something about Xenoblade Chronicles X. It doesn't deserve to be stuck on the Wii U. Anyway, in 2022 I played all of the Xenoblade games, except for X, as I don't have a Wii U anymore. I swear that's the last I'll speak of it, and there was no doubt that I enjoyed all of them immensely. Any one of them could have been my best RPG for that year. My favourite within the trilogy often fluctuates on the dime, but for me, Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is the best all-round Xenoblade experience. I hold the opinion that the original has the better story, and Xenoblade Chronicles 2 has the better combat, which was only addressed further in Torna. But what Xenoblade Chronicles 3 does have over its predecessors is that it doesn't have the notable weakness that the other two flaunted. Xenoblade Chronicles 1 had its massive world with little going on within them, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 had odd design decisions and the gacha based mechanic, which I didn't have a problem with, might I add, but I'm aware of the issue. Xenoblade Chronicles 3 on the other hand doesn't really have any of that. There was nothing that stood out to me as something that I could point to as a detrimental element that took away from my experience. It's not perfect for sure, the final boss for example was probably my least favourite part about it, but even that didn't sour my overall impression. And despite not reaching the peaks of the other two in terms of gameplay or story, it still has an excellent story and it still has excellent gameplay, if I just look at it in a bubble. I was a big fan of the options it gave to players in terms of customization, the masses of optional content, the land was captivating and vast, the music was so good, and it had the best scene direction and cinematography of the Xenoblade titles, at least in my eyes. I know some people weren't on board with those long-ass cutscenes, but that is what it's all about for me. Seeing presentation of a story like that is just the cherry on top. I get to put my controller down for a time and absorb that narrative, absorb the moments within it to understand its deeper meaning. I guess the only question people will have is, do you have to play the other two games to understand this one? No, you don't. It's mostly standalone once again, but just like Monochrome, Mobius and Monochrome Nox, if you played the prior games, you'll enjoy it more. Best of both worlds. In fact, that thought process will continue on to our next two entries as well, the first of which is Trails Through Daybreak, and I'm so giddy that I finally get to talk about this game more widely now that it has just released in the West. I played the game back in 2022, so I've been keeping pretty quiet about it outside of the odd mention here and there, but now that it's available to all on PS4, PS5, PC and Switch, I no longer have to do that. And thank God too, because Trails Through Daybreak is a brilliant experience, as befitting Trails as a series. It may be the 11th game in the series, but my love for it still shines as bright as ever. Trails Through Daybreak is effectively a soft reboot for the series, a title that brings us to the Calvard Republic, with new characters and indeed new gameplay. Now, even though it's my opinion that the soundtrack in this game is one of the weakest in recent memory, reflecting a degradation in overall quality from game to game, which seems to be a worrying trend in Falcom games as of late, I can look past that when the game is just this good. I was calling for a change to the standard turn-based style that had endured in Trails for over 10 games. I felt it had been taken to its limit with the release of Trails into Reverie, but this hybrid combat mechanic felt like just the right response to that fatigue. It's a roughly 20-80 split between action and turn-based gameplay. Falcom has taken the standard formula and spiced it up just enough to keep fans who are tiring of the original gameplay on board, while also pleasing the turn-based crowd as well. The world building and story are just as strong as ever, with the new land of the Calvard Republic standing out in many respects to its contemporaries from previous games. And the new protagonist in Van Arkwright is a breath of fresh air in many respects, standing out as one of my favourites in the series, and I'm glad to see that a lot of other people are latching on to him too. My opinions on the sequel, which was recently just confirmed for Western release in early 2025, are a bit more lukewarm, but that's just my opinion. I'm certain many people will like it way more than I did. Heck, some people thought Cold Steel 4 was a travesty, and that was my second favourite game in the series. I wear that badge with honour too. So I've no doubt the same will happen with the second Daybreak title. Even so, the first Daybreak is a masterpiece, absolutely fantastic experience from beginning to end, and you can indeed start here. Will you miss some references? Sure, but as a potential new starting point for interested onlookers who can then go back to the older games, Daybreak does exactly what it needs to do. And talking about long-running series, next up is Atelier, with Atelier Sophie 2. My personal favourite game in the series, a 10 out of 10 JRPG, and a title that encapsulates everything that is the modern Atelier experience. And it's a shame, because Riser will always be recommended over this one. No doubt the Riser trilogy is excellent too and well worth playing through, but I will not have the second Sophie game being overshadowed because of it. And just like Xenoblade Chronicles 3, it's standalone enough that you can play it with no knowledge of the first game, or indeed the mysterious trilogy that it spawned from. The glow-up of the Atelier series in recent years has been astounding. When you look at the final mysterious game in Lydian Sewell and then compare it to Sophie 2, it's hard to believe that they only existed 5 years apart from each other. Those Riser bucks must be paying dividends, but it's one thing having the dosh to do it, it's another thing entirely to actually use the funds to make a great game. But they've done just that with Atelier Sophie 2. It was one of the only games I was hugely excited for in 2022. It was the title that I was holding out hope that I could review before its release, such was my anticipation for how good the game would be, which is something I often steer away from as I'd rather play the games at my own pace. But I didn't think it would be as good as it was. Atelier Sophie 2 maintains the style of the original Mysterious trilogy in that it uses grid-based alchemy once again, but adds its own flair to set it apart. Exploration is once again done very well with the addition of the weather manipulating mechanic. The OST is absolutely excellent near on all the way through, sporting one of my favourite battle themes of all time, and it also goes back to its traditional turn-based gameplay, and at the same time improves massively on the original Sophie's battle system, which was admittedly a little clunky in execution. I'm not one to point out graphics either most of the time, but this game looks amazing. Sure, it's not cutting edge, but it's got that vibrant feel as you would expect from the series, yet the roughness attributable to its style is mostly gone. Character models look smooth and pleasing on the eye, and weather effects will show on their faces, demonstrating how far Gust have come in such a short time. The humorous side events are just as good as ever with the new cast of characters playing their part well, but Atelier Sophie 2 focuses on the one aspect that the games generally lack in, that being the story. Again, it's not the most groundbreaking, but it was clear that the journey was to be a focus in this game, on top of these standard elements like alchemy and exploration, and I pretty much loved every single minute of it. If you are paying mind to trying out Atelier, give heed to putting Atelier Sophie 2 on your list as well. Next up is Tales of, and it's going to go to Tales of Arise. Is it perfect? No, but it's still an excellent game. I couldn't put it down from start to finish 3 years ago, and it was easily in my top 10 games for 2021. Well deserved too. It also had to pick up a bit of slack too, because its big brother, Tales of Vesperia, massively let me down that year, so it had a lot to make up for. If anything, that made its task even harder to accomplish. I'm glad to say though that it did just that. Tales of Arise, while not my favourite game in the series, definitely delivered on the expectation I had of it. The obvious start point is the aesthetic. Arise is one of the best looking JRPGs you will see, a gold standard for the genre in terms of graphical prowess. The art team saw the make it look good target in the open water, loaded their shells and pretty much buried it in the deepest trench. Figuratively speaking, they blew it out the water. The exploration itself was a bit on rails, I admit, but I never got bored looking at this game. It was a marvel in terms of visuals. But then there's the other aspects, like the combat, which, though not as deep as the likes of Vesperia, was more well-paced overall, giving you options much earlier on so you can truly experiment rather than waiting till New Game Plus. And the characters were also enjoyable, at least for me. There was humour sold well via the skits, some heartfelt moments, and decent emotional impact through their delivery, which again comes down to the top tier presentation. And though I feel the game started to lose steam near the end, especially in that final dungeon, which I consider as one of the worst final dungeons I've played through in memory, it held firm to be an overall positive experience. I feel that Tales of Arise gets a lot of criticism now in hindsight, and sure, some of it is deserved, but it's far from the travesty that some people make it out to be. Like I say, I see it as one of the best games released that year, and I played a lot in 2021. For it to stand out among the 25 or so other JRPGs I played that year speaks to its overall quality. Flawed in respects, but still an excellent game nonetheless. Alright, we're shifting up to 2024, and I can't in good faith not put this on the list. Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance. People may have issue with Atlus and their practice of re-releasing better versions of the same game, and yes, I think they should give a special offer to those who bought the game before, like half price for the upgrade, but Vengeance is such an improvement on the base version. It's not just a spruced up remaster, it's basically a full-on game in of itself, and easily one of the best JRPGs to release this year. I guess that's a spoiler for my list come the end of the year. And the thing is, I could recommend Persona 5 Royal here, which also would deserve its place, but much like Atelier Sophie 2, Shin Megami Tensei as a franchise just gets overshadowed by Persona, which is a shame, and that's why I'd rather put Vengeance on here because it is so good. Initially, just having the option to play on PC instead of the Switch is worth the price alone. The Switch just could not handle what the original SMT5 wanted to show, and it was one of the big detriments to my experience when I played it. There's no doubt it needed some sort of frame cap in order to help. Thankfully, the PC version not only had those caps, but it had options like 4K resolution, 120 FPS, anti-blur, all that good stuff. All the stuff that Shin Megami Tensei 5 as a game deserved when it first came out. But then the improvements, the press turn system, still as awesome as ever, but bringing in unique passive skills for each demon, very cool. The ability to zip around the different darts via the Magotsuhi rails alleviated the issue of backtracking, the ability to save wherever you wanted, a whole host of new demons, new mechanics like the demon haunts who have a social link-like feature, and of course the new Vengeance route itself, which is just so much better than the original one, at least for me. The story of Shin Megami Tensei has never been its highlight, but I much prefer the canon of Vengeance to the canon of Creation. It's got way more nuance, better flow, and better overall endings too. I said it in my dedicated video before, but Atlus have simply taken a very good game and improved on it in nearly every area. There is not one thing I look at in Vengeance that I feel is worse than the original. Excellent JRPG, challenging no doubt, but well worth the time of any fan of the genre. And we're sticking with 2024 with our penultimate entry, which is going to be the sadly mistreated Megaton Musashi Wired. Level 5 dropped the ball on this one, because they had a sleeper hit and they never gave it a chance to succeed. Not blowing my own horn here, but I think I sold more of this game than Level 5 did. And saying that they don't have much money to market their games, that is not an excuse. You market games to help them succeed. You set aside a budget to do that. And the thing is, they did do some marketing, but they did nothing that would draw attention to it. So yes, I do blame them, because Megaton Musashi Wired deserves so much better than what it got. It's basically a mix of 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim, Gundam mechs, the art style of The World Ends With You, and the gameplay loop of Grand Blue Fantasy Relink. In fact, I think this is better than Grand Blue Fantasy Relink, which I also thought was awesome. I wasn't on board with the late game offerings, but I still stated that Relink was great. Still, Wired is better. It has a much stronger story and collection of characters overall, and better customization for the different units too. In fact, Megaton Musashi Wired is arguably defined by its customization. You have unique classes of mech called rogues in this universe that all have set bonuses tied to them and specific strengths they bring to the table, like the Musashi unit, the Sparkman and the Gaudia. Most of the parts you find for these mechs come from missions. On these missions you'll get hordes of loot to make up the mech that suits you, and these parts like legs, arm and body will have a level assigned to them linked to your own pilot level, which rises after the missions. There's also rarity, from common all the way up to legendary. But it's not just the body parts, you have a huge array of weapons, both melee and ranged, to choose from. You have mods that can be installed into the parts, a motherboard layout where you can add CPUs and cooling fans that specialises the mech even further. Combat itself takes on a slick and enjoyable action-centric style, very smooth and responsive, and it only gets better over time. The rogue units can use ranged attacks, melee moves, and have a host of skills tied to them. Naturally as well, you can switch between mechs on the fly. In addition, the mechs have their own pilots, and these pilots have their own skills they bring to the table, so yet more mechanics to work with to find a style that suits you. The maps are quite linear, and most of them are recycled too, so they're not too inspired all said and done, but they do the job well enough. Exploration is serviceable. You take control of a specified character for that part of the story and go to different parts of the town, shop around, do side quests, which actually aren't too bad for this game, and find hidden items. And like I've already mentioned, the story is really good and presents it well by combining this pleasing art style with scenes from the anime. It does somewhat fall apart by the end, of which that I will admit, but that is clearly due to a lack of budget and time. When 90% of it was decent, I'm not going to come down too hard on it. It really does deserve more attention, and that's exactly why I'm putting it up here. And the final game for this list will be the awe-inspiring, the memorable, the excellent Octopath Traveler 2. Just like Atelier Sophie 2, this is a 10 out of 10 JRPG for me, my favourite game of 2023 without question, and near on flawless. Any issues it does have are minute in terms of the overall experience, and despite its name, no, you don't need to play the first game, it's completely standalone. I could not put this game down from the moment I picked it up all the way to the end, and I'm certain one reason for that is how different it feels from the traditional approach to the genre. Octopath Traveler 2 just releases you into the wild to make your own story. It gives you so much freedom in a genre that doesn't really champion that aspect. I was so enamoured with the world and the multitude of ways I could interact with it. There were secrets at every turn, engrossing world building and deep lore formed the cornerstones of much of the journey. Adding on to its exploration was its fantastic combat, fast, visceral, oozing in customization, and even though one of the only drawbacks of the game involved revisiting inns to reshuffle the party at points, it wasn't a problem for me as I was just so hooked on the combat. Not to mention each character felt wholly unique in what they brought to the table. And it wasn't just on the battlefield that they showed their differing personalities, as the game also had 8 different stories that all combined together into a cohesive whole by the end. But it only provides the surface level information. There's far more to find if you look, if you engage with the environment. When you do that, you find so much more to each of these stories beneath the surface, and it adds more to this wonderful world that Octopath Traveler 2 presents. This game is not only masterful in gameplay, it is masterful in its narrative too. This is a gold standard JRPG for me. It is one I will remember fondly a decade later, and one that I will also measure many other games against. I was astounded in what they were able to achieve for this game, but the world is indeed better off for its existence. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe for more JRPG content, and consider joining my Patreon if you're interested. Peace.